Hey, everybody, welcome to the podcast. You're listening to the longest running superhero role playing game on earth. I'm your host, the Game Master, and this past weekend, I got to meet Dan Gilvezan on Father's Day. And for anybody who doesn't know who Dan is, he was the voice of Spider Man on an old cartoon called Spider Man and His Amazing Friends, which, if I recall correctly, was actually my introduction to the Marvel Universe. I remember as a little kid playing on the jungle gym and pretending that I was Spider Man, or getting into my grandmother's sewing supplies and stealing spools of thread so I could make my own spider webs. Anyways, so Spider Man, and specifically Dan's performance as Spider Man, was a huge part of my childhood. So it was awesome to meet him on Sunday. And it was even more mind blowing to run a game for him and to get him to actually play Spider Man in our role playing game. So that is what today's video is all about. But before we get into that, smash that like button, make sure you're subscribed, and leave us a comment. That helps us out on our end with the YouTube algorithm, but also we love to hear from you guys. We've got an awesome community here, and it's all thanks to you. So thank you so much for being here. So, all that said, let's dive in. So, on Sunday, my family and I drove to Fort Wayne, Indiana, where we met Dan and his family. And it was awesome for a multitude of reasons. One of the big ones being that since it was Father's Day, most of the convention goers had already left for the weekend. So, unlike most cons, there was no rush at this one. I was able to hang around Dan's table for as long as we wanted. He and I spoke briefly about some of the other characters that he played, like Bumblebee from the original Transformers cartoon. And after that, I told him that we'd been going to conventions and meeting various celebrities. And if they were willing, we were having them play whatever character they were best known for in our role playing game. And Dan kind of nodded, letting me know that he was focused on what I was saying, but I couldn't tell if he knew what a role playing game was. So I asked him if he'd ever heard of Dungeons and Dragons. And he said he had, but he hadn't had the opportunity to play an RPG yet, which I thought was cool because thus far I have had to explain what a role playing game is to every celebrity we've met. So it was really cool that he already understood the basic concept. So I told him it would be awesome on our end if he would be willing to play Spider Man, and he was happy to do so. So I'm standing there looking right into the eyes of Spider Man himself, right? And now I've got to run a game for him. And I gotta say, I was really intimidated. But I started it and I said, okay, Spidey, it's a typical day in New York and you don't have to work today. What would you like to do? So Dan nods, and in his Spider Man voice, where he projects a little more than usual, he says, well, I guess I'll throw on the old costume and web sling around town to see if there's any crime that needs dealt with. And I gotta say, hearing the voice and having him get more into it than previous celebrities was awesome. But then it also sort of felt like more pressure than I had had before because other guys were kind of like less into it. They'd sort of look to the side and struggle to figure out what we were doing exactly. But Dan was on the ball. So on my end, I felt this like pressure to perform. So I tell him that after he makes a couple passes through the city, it seems like a pretty quiet day. There are a few minor crimes, but the boys in blue have it under control. No supervillains or anything like that. Dan nods and he sort of makes the not bad meme face and says, great. Well, since that's the case, I'd like to spend some time with my whole family. And this was one of many moments that caught my attention. He stressed the word whole, as if to suggest that Spider Man had a lot of kids. And up until now, we've only ever talked about May, aka Mayday Parker, who around the year 2000 was Spider Girl. But we use real time in our game. So she's 25 years older now, she's a middle-aged woman, and she has an adult son who is Peter Parker the second, and he is a Spider-Man in his own right. So I mentioned this, and more things caught my attention. Dan nodded like he'd heard of Spider-Girl before. Me mentioning Mayday was not me telling him something he didn't already know. And as for us using real time, even before I explained that we did, I noticed that that was his assumption. The Peter that he was playing right off the bat was older, wiser, more confident. And I think that Dan was correctly assuming that this is a Peter who hung out with Firestar and Iceman back in the 80s. So therefore, that much time has passed, right? He also had correctly assumed that he married Mary Jane Watson in our game. Not that that is that much of a leap. I feel like that's kind of an obvious answer. But then what Dan seemed to imply was if Peter was married to a hottie like MJ, they were going to have a ton of kids, you know? Um, so I was kind of like, oh, okay. And then I sort of chuckled. And mind you, to me, this guy is Spider Man, right? So if he wants a zillion kids, then we are going to say he has a zillion kids. Kind of like in terms of our continuity, whatever Dan wants, he gets. I was actually reminded then too of this one day at a comic book store I used to hang out at in the 90s, right around the time of the famous Spider-Man clone saga. And one of the guys in that comic shop was talking about how in the comics at the time, Mary Jane was pregnant. And he said, wouldn't it be cool if she just like laid a ton of eggs? And that comment stuck with me that there is spider DNA going on here. And we tend to make very human assumptions about what Peter's kids would be like. Suddenly, I was kind of wondering, yeah, what if MJ did lay like a ton of eggs or something like that? Or at the very least, what if Mayday had siblings that we've just never mentioned before? It's kind of a wild idea. And the other thing that didn't even hit me until we were driving home from the convention was the clone saga and how in the Spider Girl comics they revisited that idea. And Mayday was clone. And humorously, the clone of May was April. And I could totally see Peter being aware that April Parker exists and he'd raise her like a daughter too. And who knows how many more clones there could be, right? June Parker, January Parker. I mean, the sky's the limit, I guess. And whether these are the actual children of Peter or clones of his children, either way, I think that Peter would spend time with all of them and love them all. And suddenly, this opened the floodgates for the idea that all of these girls probably married some guy and had even more kids. So, how many grandkids does old man Peter have by the year 2025, right? And normally, I would have all the time in the world to tell a player, hey, I need to think about this. Let's put a pin in it, think it through, make sure it sounds like something we really want to do. But I'm on the spot. So I just roll with it because this is Dan Gilvezan, right? And I might never get a chance like this again. So he says he wants to spend time with his whole family, his kids, their spouses, their kids, and maybe their kids' spouses, right? Who knows how far this goes? I mean, for that matter, I always ran Spider Girl like she was my age. So her son would be about the same age as my own son, right? In real life. And my son is old enough to have kids now. So that would be yet another generation of Parkers, a veritable spider swarm. Anyways, so I'm running the game and I tell Dan it's cool. He wants Peter to spend the day with the whole family. So I ask him what they would do together. And he says, I want to take all of them out to see the newest Spider Man movie. So this too gets my attention for a couple of reasons. First, and most obvious probably, is Spider Man lives in a world where they make Spider Man movies, right? So at first glance, that seems weird. But I think I get where he's coming from. Aside from being the voice of our friendly neighborhood Spider Man, Dan was also the voice of a different kind of bug, a plucky little yellow Volkswagen named Bumblebee, who was a very popular character from the 80s Transformers cartoon. And on that cartoon, in some of the background shots, especially in season two, if you looked closely, you would see movie theaters, and on the marquee, you would often see Transformers the movie. So it would seem that in the world in which Bumblebee exists, he could go watch a Transformers movie about him and his friends back in 1985. I'm guessing that Dan is well aware of this fact since he seemed so keenly aware of so many other bits of pop culture trivia that I brought up as we hang out we're hanging out that afternoon. So I think in Dan's mind, if Bumblebee can go watch a movie about himself, why can't Spider Man? Now, as the GM, they certainly don't want some supervillain buying a movie ticket, seeing the Spider Man movie, and learning that Spider Man is Peter Parker or that he married Mary Jane, because obviously we don't want the villains threatening Peter's loved ones. Sort of an Uncle Ben situation all over again. But it doesn't seem too far fetched to me who imagine a different kind of Spider Man movie, where Spider Man is just a mysterious crime fighter. If the general public has no idea who he is, then maybe in this movie, the fictional Spider Man just never takes off his mask. I can think of a handful of old pulp heroes and even some masked cowboys who fell into that category, and it didn't stop people from telling stories about them or enjoying them. So I sort of repeated this idea back to Dan, and he seemed very sure that, first of all, Peter would allow people to make these movies. And secondly, he'd get a kick out of them. And he for sure wanted to take his kids, grandkids, etc., to all go see the new movie. So the next thing that jumps out at me is that this suggests that Spider Man is no longer in the crosshairs of J. Jonah Jameson. And if people are going to go see movies about him, it sounds to me like Spidey would no longer have mistrust. By 2025, he'd be a beloved icon and a household name. And apparently, this Spider Man has the popularity advantage rather than the mistrust drawback. So that's a change from the traditional Spider Man. Another departure is Peter would no longer be the down and out guy without a penny to his name. The older, more confident Peter can afford to take his entire spider swarm out to the movies, pay for all the tickets, drinks, popcorn, etc. So I thought that was interesting too. Anyways, so while they are all there doing the whole family thing, we then bring in Dr. Octopus, who on Spider Man and His Amazing Friends was played by Michael Bell, who was sitting to Dan's immediate right. And as Dan has been playing, Michael has been listening and figuring out what a role playing game is and how you play. Anyway, so Doc Ock attacks. And as you may have already guessed, he is ridiculously outnumbered. Peter's daughters have the same powers as their dad. The grandkids all do too. And even the son in laws are wearing some sort of symbiote so they can get in on the action as well. Speaking of the son in law thing, by the way, I asked Dan if he thought Peter would give a son in law a hard time. And Dan was quick to say no. Peter loves everyone and he just wants his daughters to be happy. Good answer. Anyway, so the whole spider swarm stomps Doc Ock, and the supervillain is webbed up from a light pole in front of the movie theater. And we are talking about a lot of webs. That's of this entire huge, unwieldy group of characters now. Anyways, so that brings us to the epilogue of this adventure, which is that the moviegoers who went to go see this Spider-Man movie can now take selfies with Doc Ock as he yells and complains, which we thought was kind of a funny idea. And Spider-Man and his amazing family are there too to sign autographs, pose for selfies, etc., And that was it. Now, that said, Dan and Michael are known for other characters too, so we played more than just this one brief Spider Man game. After this, I asked Dan to play Bumblebee, and he did, but that's a story for a different day. Anyways, we loved this one. We hope that you did too. If so, as always, smash like, make sure you're subscribed, and leave us a comment. And from everybody here at the longest running superhero role playing game on earth, we hope you have a good one, and we'll see you in the next adventure. Bye.